So, the first unit we talked about in class was neurology. Neurology makes up the lobes of the brain. So, we have the frontal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. So, the prefrontal lobe contains personality, insight, and foresight, and the frontal lobe also has a precentral gyrus, which is a motor strip, but it's also called a motor cortex. Broca's areas, which is a type of aphasia, is also stored in the frontal lobe. Damage to the frontal lobe causes impaired and slow speech. Broca's aphasia is non-fluent, so this means what you say makes sense, but it takes you a while to think of it. So it's a lot of words such as and, for, just smaller words. Then we have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe has the postcentral gyrus, which is a sensory strip, which is different from the prefrontal lobe, which has the motor strip. And then it also has the supramarginal gyrus for writing and the angular gyrus for reading. Next, we have the temporal lobe. This is the lobe that contains the Herschel's gyrus for auditory cortex. And then this is with Wernicke's area. So this is a different type of aphasia. So Wernicke's aphasia is the comprehension of written and spoken language. So it's receptive instead of expressive. So you understand what is being said to you. You do not understand what is being said to you. And the sentence you said does not make sense. So, for example, somebody could ask you the question of, what is the weather outside? And somebody with the first type of aphasia could say, it is warm. So it's broken up, but it makes sense. But with this aphasia, it could be like, my daughter is at work right now. It's a jumbled jargon mess. They think what they're saying makes sense, but in reality, it does not make any sense. Then we have the occipital lobe. This is just for vision. It's in the back of the brain. Additionally, of communication pathways, communication takes place at a synapse, which is where they pass through chemical signals that are each separated by a cleft. There's also a lot of subcortical structures which are within the brain, not on the outsides. The corpus callosum is one of them, and that is a pathway for communication that is between the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. Additionally, there's the cerebellum, which is for balance, and it is also a subcortical structure, and it is technically like a mini brain. Then we have the brainstem. The brainstem is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. All of this information was from the Nourishment and Protection of the Brain Neurology PowerPoint. Then we also have the cerebrovascular supply. So this is talking about the circle of Willis, which we talked about. So there's a constant circulation, which is a requirement of the nervous system. It supplies oxygen as well as glucose. There are two sources of blood from the heart to the brain. So these two sources are the carotid artery and the vertebral artery. So the circle of Willis is made up of the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, and the anterior and posterior communicating arteries. So it's two different structures that connect the cricoid and the vertebral system. And the purpose of the circle of Willis is to promote equal distribution of blood everywhere around the body. And that is from the PowerPoint Neuroanatomy, the Basics, and the Beast. So moving on from that, we also have how messages travel in the brain. So first we have the anatomy of what a neuron is and what makes up one. So the cell body is where it begins, and it contains the nucleus. We have the dendrite, which transmits info towards the cell body. The axon conducts info away from the cell body. The axon helix is the junction of the axon and the cell body. The myelin sheath is the fatty substance that covers the axon, and this myelin sheath speeds up the conduction, so without it, it would be slower. Then we have the nodes of Ravenier. These are areas between the myelinid segments on the axon, which are very important in conduction. We also have axon terminals, which are long, thin projections at the end of the axon. And there's terminal buttons, like little circles at the end of them. And those little terminal buttons contain synaptic clefts, synaptic vesicles. And then the synaptic vesicles contain neurotransmitters, which are responsible for activating the next neuron. Additionally, we have action potential. So action potential is when an impulse is received from a dendrite or originates from the nucleus in the cell body, and it travels all the way down the axon, and then with myelin it would occur faster. It reaches the axon terminal, which contains the synaptic vesicles, and then the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. So the disorder I chose to talk about was Down syndrome. So I decided to look into how Down syndrome impacts the lobes of the brain. So I found that according to the Down syndrome brain in the presence and absence of fibrillar website, Down syndrome impacts the areas such as the lobes of the brain by there being a thicker frontal and occipitaloparietal cortex and a thinner motor cortex. And then also, there was a recent report of an increased cortical thickness in the frontal, parietal, and occipital lobes in children and young adults with Down syndrome.